Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the SDP's first forum online, and we're trying out this new modality. And please forgive us if we run into technical glitches, but we hope it works. So we have a really distinguished panel of some of the leading lights of Singapore's civil society here to talk about this question about how the pandemic has changed the world and how and if Singapore can change. Of course, we believe that Singapore can, and we're going to hear different perspectives on how it can. Now, again, I'm sure everyone knows that this pandemic is completely unprecedented. It's quite funny though. I was doing ward rounds about a month ago, and I was rounding on this young man, and I was trying to enroll him in a clinical trial. And he said to me, "You're an infectious disease professor, right?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you've been waiting your whole life for a pandemic like this." I said, "Well, not exactly." He said, "They keep coming. We had SARS, we had Nipah, we had Zika." He said, "Yeah, but nothing like this." And I said, "Yes, you're right." And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was listening in on the St. Andrew's Cathedral Sunday service, and the vicar made a comment. He said that in late January, they had a planning meeting, and they were planning for various activities and programs that they were going to have. And he said that at that meeting, if he had stood up and said, "No, I think the cathedral is going to be closed. We're not going to have any services. We're not going to visit anybody. We're only going to have one staff come in to do emergency repairs." He said they would have hauled him off into some quiet place somewhere. So this is something that's really taken most people completely by surprise. And it's not just the pandemic itself, but it's the reaction and the responses to it. In fact, I travel a lot, and my wife really doesn't like that. I was supposed to be in London and as well as in Atlanta for various scientific meetings. And then, of course, both of those meetings got canceled. And what is interesting, though, is even though those meetings were canceled, but yet in the last couple of weeks, I've actually done conferences in the Mayo Clinic, in Canada, in Boston, and all of them have been online, and they've been really good interaction without having to spend thousands of dollars on airplane tickets, you know, flying there, destroying the universe in the process with all the emissions. So there have been a lot of negatives, but I think what we want to look at today is how the future can be in a post-pandemic world. And we have four really good speakers who are going to talk to us about this. We have Connie Singham, Alfian Sa'at, Kirsten Han, and Tan Hao. And the first speaker to kick it off is Connie Singham. Connie Singham needs no introduction, but she is known as the godmother of civil society in Singapore. She's a writer and civil society activist. In the last 35 years, Connie has led women's organizations such as AWARE and the SCWO, the Singapore Council of Women's Organizations. She's co-founded civil society groups TWC1, TWC2, and TWC3, and has been a columnist for various national newspapers and publications. Her works include editing a history of TWC, building social space in Singapore, representing Singapore women, and the art of advocacy in Singapore, which is kind of like the encyclopedia of advocacy in Singapore for anyone who's interested in the subject, as well as two memoirs, Where I Was, a memoir from the margins, and Never Leave Town Without Chili Sauce. She blogs at her own blog, and she's got a couple of other blogs which I think are not that active, but also dealing with this issue too. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Connie to share her vision to answer this question, can Singapore change?
Thank you, Paul. And it's nice to be here with Alfian and Tan Hao and Kirsten. So I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. I'm actually the grandmother now of civil society. I've been there for such a long time. Your question, can Singapore change? And I want to ask the question, can Singaporeans imagine a different Singapore? And I think that's going to be very hard, you know, but I will place my bet on Singaporeans rather than on the government. Because the government has relied on economic growth as a primary means of spreading prosperity and promoting equality of opportunity. But that reliance, and everybody has, all the experts have said that, but that reliance on the economy as the only path towards greater prosperity has been a mistake. Those policies have failed us in important ways. Dependence on migrant workforce and the abuse and exploitation of these workers, which has been highlighted during this pandemic. Life has become harder for many Singaporeans. It's going to be even worse as we face a recession. After the pandemic, I worry about the hundreds of thousands of young people who are going to be without jobs. Social problems have multiplied. Racism, xenophobia, huge income disparity, unacceptable levels of poverty, breakdown of meritocracy, and then we now have the aging population, vulnerable to illness, loneliness, and poverty. And I have to say that all these have been highlighted and brought to the forefront of our consciousness by civil society activists. So I think we have to turn to civil society for a different vision of Singapore. When I'm talking about civil society, I'm not talking just about organizations like AWARE and Home and TWC2 or Nature Society. I'm talking about a wider community of individuals as well, academics, intellectuals, writers. All these people have been part of civil society and have, in the last 10 years especially, been very active in raising awareness about the problems we are facing. But another point I want to bring up is that there's so much misunderstanding about civil society. They're not the opposition political party. You have to see them as stakeholders in the making of a progressive Singapore. And they will be that, whatever political party holds power. I come from 40 years of civil society activism. I have met and worked with many activists in the various sectors. In fact, perhaps 3 generations of activists. And what they have done in raising awareness, bringing unique knowledge and experience to shape policy, build capacity, give voice to marginalized and underrepresented. Across these diversity of activities and interests, what defines them and unites them is their patriotism. Their love of their country, their passion, their commitment to their country. They volunteer their time and energy. They work very hard and they take risks to promote a different, more compassionate and caring society. First and foremost, and I want to say this and emphasize this because I hear so many nonsense going around, they are driven by their love of their country. I'm very passionate about civil society activism. If any community is truly multicultural, it is these organizations. Their activities, their democratic processes, their associations, these multiculturalism and democratic practices, the alternative ideas, limit the homogenization of our culture and the groupthink we attract in. So we need civil society, their capacity to offer alternative ideas and ways of thinking, to break through the shackles of our imagination. I like that term, shackles of our imagination. Somebody brought it up in webinar recently. So I said, oh, I must use that. But the civil society that seemed to attract most attention, especially government's attention, is TWC2 currently and home. And why? Because the problems within that sector is so serious and government doesn't know what to do about it. And so they don't like civil society and NGOs to point that out to them. But they are important, essential stakeholders to correct a situation that need to be looked into. I'm convinced that if MOM had listened to TWC2, they would not have found themselves backfooted. My final point is, what do we do after this lockdown? Going forward, what do we do? I think our government must recognize the significance of civil society and work with them. Currently, we have outdated, intimidating regulatory frameworks which stand in the way of a more open space for civil society activism. So, and then secondly, this is going to take a long time, but slow work, important work. The political landscape has to change. I'm not looking at a change in government, but certainly a bigger role for the opposition parties to reduce PAP majority so we have a parliament of more checks and balances. But one of the things that we have learned in this lockdown period is what has it taught us as individuals? As I said earlier, I depend on individuals. Singaporeans can change. And during this period, we have learned that we can live with less, much less. We don't have to be consumer obsessed, a throwaway society. And then an important point, lots of people have learned to cook and eat as a family, which we don't do very often. And then the importance of a community, nurturing a community of friends and neighbors. And often we are such busy people and we work such long hours, we don't have to do that. We do need to do that when we learned how essential those communities are during this lockdown. We have shown compassion and generosity, and I hope that continues. We have learned about about the situation of the migrant workers. We appreciate their work. Will our relationship with them change? Will it change our behavior and attitude? Because the way we look at migrant workers and others tells us the kind of people we are. What kind of people, and that's one question we have to raise. What kind of people are we? Working from home can be productive. Employers have learned to trust their employees to be productive. They don't have to supervise them. So the employers can be more flexible with work arrangements. And small businesses have become more creative. You know, it reminds me of the times when I was growing up. Everything can be got at our doorstep. And what a livelier community that was. You know, and when we are old, like I am, and you stay at home, you don't see very many people. I don't want to do internet banking. I want to be able to go to the bank and talk to people. I want people at my doorstep delivering things so I can have a chat. I can see real people. And this webinar is such a boom for civil society because it reaches so many people. That young people are using technology and social media to organize themselves. And final point that I have discovered and learned and experienced is that in the last 5 to 10 years, I've seen so many young people coming forward and volunteering, and they have been very active during this period. So there is hope with the younger generation of people coming forward. And all these ideas that they are not huge changes. They're little things that have entered into our consciousness and we have learned from this experience. But it can change the way we live. It can change the way we treat people, especially those who do the jobs with so little appreciation. It can change the political culture. People can change. We need more people being active, civil society activists. And with that, I will leave for the others to carry on. And I'm sure they have a lot more interesting things to say. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you very much, Constance. That was a perfect start to this session. You know, I think you've highlighted some of the key elements that we have sort of rediscovered. You know, the idea of working from home where you don't have somebody looking over your shoulder and making sure that you're there at the office when the boss leaves, you know, which is so totally unproductive. And you know, I look young, but I still remember my grandmother's place where they used to have the tok tok noodle guy, and she would give us an egg to give to him to put into the char kway teow. And you know, that kind of intimacy with the service provider rather than being in a big mega mall. And it's kind of a delight to see some of these big mega malls shut down in a way. But I think what's really special about what Connie said was that this pandemic has highlighted the role of civil society. Because civil society goes where the government and even the opposition parties cannot go. Because civil society goes right down to the people, you know, to the grassroots, to the people on the margins, to the people who are outside of so-called the mainstream. And this current epidemic with so many thousands of migrant workers infected has really brought this home, the tremendous value of civil society. And for the benefit of our members who are listening in, I also like your point. The civil society is not the opposition party, and we cannot take civil society for granted. And in fact, we should count on civil society holding us to account just as much as you hold the government to account. And I think we appreciate that too. So that was a really good start, and I have a lot of confidence that Alfian's going to do even better. So our next speaker, again, is a very well-known Singaporean, Alfian Sa'at, poet, writer, and playwright. His published works include 3 collections of poetry. At least one of them is behind me on the shelf. One Fierce Hour, A History of Amnesia and the Invisible Manuscript. A collection of short stories, Corridor. a collection of flash fiction, Malay sketches, 3 collections of plays, as well as the published play Cooling Off Day. Alfian has won Best Original Script at the Live Theatre Awards 4 times. In 2001, he won the Golden Point Award for Poetry, as well as the National Arts Council Young Artist Award for Literature. He's also been nominated for the Singapore Literature Prize 3 times, for Corridor in 1999, for which he won the Commendation Prize, A History of Amnesia in 2004, and his translation of the novel The Widower in 2016. His plays and short stories have been translated into German, Swedish, Danish, and Japanese. So that's a really impressive CV. Alfian, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. Okay, first things first. I don't think I will present something better than Connie. I don't think I don't think there's a competition, and actually this kind of
No, I didn't mean that at all.
No, I said that, it's my fault.
Something different.
Yeah, go ahead, Alfian.
Yeah, it's that kind of like neoliberal competitive logic that brought us to where we are now, right? So
That's right.
I also want to say that before this particular webinar, I've also been watching a lot of other webinars, some by the Workers' Party, Youth Wing, some by Academia.sg, some by civil society activists. So I really feel that all of us are in this together to create some kind of like common pool of knowledge and expertise, right? And actually these kinds of strange adversarial relationships that sometimes people formulate, either government versus civil society or the state versus the artists, I think all those things are not productive, and they are illusory actually, because I think all of us want good things for the country. Yeah. Okay, as Connie has pointed out. So my little discussion will cover 3 broad points regarding what I feel needs to change in Singapore society. And those 3 points will be, I will cover number 1, the arts, number 2, the environment, and number 3, issues surrounding disability in Singapore. So the first part, the arts, is of course something that's very close to me, and people can say, oh, I'm speaking out of a sense of vested interest because I am a playwright and theatre maker in Singapore. But I would like to echo what Casey Chu said in a Workers' Party webinar, where he said there needs to be greater government investment in the arts. Currently, what we are witnessing is that arts companies, arts groups, freelance individuals, they are really very deeply affected at the moment. And why I feel there needs to be this investment is because I feel currently in a kind of circuit breaker, lockdown / isolation, a lot of us are realizing the value of the arts. It's the place that we turn to for our mental health, for solace, for consolation. We're listening to music, we're reading books. And actually an argument can be made about how essential it is, right? Because right now I think that we've got kind of very narrow definitions of what is essential and non-essential activity. I always feel that in terms of a kind of soul food, the arts is really something essential. So the thing about the arts is that when we create products, we don't just claim that this is ours, but more importantly, what the arts creates are products where we say, this is us. It's really about creating cultural capital, for the future. And usually with the arts, what happens is that they eventually become part of the commons. So if you write a book one day, it's going to end up in the library. Your art is going to end up in gallery, and all these things end up, for example, also in songs, whose lyrics are memorized in our pool of shared cultural references, right? So this is something about the arts as well. Some people feel that it's an elitist and an abstract activity, but actually it's much more widespread and so much more integrated into our lives than I think we acknowledge. Yeah. So what the arts does, I'm making a kind of appeal for it, but it does facilitate meaningful connections. It helps us to navigate diversity. It encourages democratic participation. Okay, so those things are meaningful to me. But of course, if the state wants to ask the question, what can the arts provide for the state, or in terms of like fulfilling certain state agendas, then I will say certain things like resilience, right? Community, even contributing to total psychological defense. Yeah, I can speak that language too, by the way. So I believe that when we are creating all these works of art, we are doing things in a much more sustained way than just having one day of NDP celebration, or just having one Singapore day, where you're trying to connect with overseas Singaporeans. Um, and artists are not just engaging with the public. When you create this kind of art platforms, you also allow the public to engage with itself. Yeah. So as one example in which I think there could be greater investment in the arts, um, I feel like right now a very important topic is that of migrant workers in Singapore. And I think there is an opportunity for example, the National Arts Council to start supporting migrant worker art activities, including migrant worker poetry, including migrant worker bands, etc. Because I think that is really a way of thinking of how we can integrate them into our community, and also how we can center their voices. Because I really feel also sometimes when we're talking about migrant workers, we do it in quite a paternalistic kind of way. We are trying to speak on their behalf. Yeah, but and some people might argue, oh, it's because of like language or translation. But I think it's so important to center their voices and experiences. And an example I have is way before this pandemic, me and the substation, we were actually designing this project. We wanted to initiate a migrant workers community museum. So it was going to be a museum that was going to be designed and curated by migrant workers. They decide what to include. They decide how to approach the communities to procure certain objects, etc., which is going to be able to tell their story and their history. And in this way, become a kind of symbolic community, as well as a civic community. Yeah. So we had this really lovely discussions where, Filipinos were talking about, oh, I want to bring in a balik bayan box. Yeah, which is a box that you send back to your family, and you put in a lot of goodies. Like from Singapore, you will put in like salted egg potato chips, some Singapore specialty. And then a migrant worker said, oh, I want to bring in an example of a bunk bed that I have in my dormitory. And then some domestic workers were saying, okay, I would like to record videos of some of the nursery rhymes in my mother tongue language that I use to sing to my little charge. Yeah. So I think these are definitely avenues that we can look at. But I will definitely argue for greater investment in the arts. And, this question of what can we change, I always feel is a question of political will, right, in Singapore. It's really about, do the people who are in power, do they want to change? Okay. So my second point looks at the environment. And I think the pandemic has given us this very rare opportunity where we're having this enforced pause on human activity and all the kinds of pollution that it creates. So I think in some countries, even in Singapore, we're experiencing clearer skies, cleaner waters, and somewhere in the Arctic, a very big ozone hole has closed up. So all this is a very visible demonstration of what a reduction in human activity can do for the planet. Is healing, and I do hope that this kind of pause can, there's some kind of momentum, and we can extend certain behavioral changes even in a post-pandemic world. Yeah, and I would like to particularly, sure, I would like to particularly draw attention to two young climate activists who were holding up placards, right? So on 13th March, a climate activist, 18-year-old Wong Jae-min, she went to the Harbourfront Tower 1, and she held up this cardboard placards, some of which would said "Planet over Profit," and then school strike for climate. And another climate activist, about like a week later, 22nd March, Nguyen Nhat Min, who's 19 years old, he put out a placard, Toa Payoh Central, and it said SG is better than oil. And I think it's really important to try to pay attention to their message, to what young people are saying, especially because this is their future. And that's why they're trying to connect with this wider movement, which is Fridays for Future, right? Which is a global school strike movement initiated by Greta Thunberg. So I think the young have a lot of very important things to tell us. Um, this developmentalist narrative that we have in Singapore is apparently one of triumphalist economic prosperity. Yeah, and people will say, oh, don't look at the good old days because we didn't have proper all these modern trappings, etc. But also, I think it is a much poorer world that we have because of all the species extinction, because of all the erratic weather patterns. And I think we just need to be very, very careful about the kind of planet that we are passing on to our children. Yeah. So I think this next point is, pay attention to environmental issues and pay attention, especially to the young. In terms of personal action, I acknowledge that people are becoming ethical consumers using reusable bags, their own food containers, metal straws, etc. Some of these can be a little bit trendy, but I think we should also deal with larger fundamental questions about, as Constance has touched on previously, how much do we really need to consume? How much do we really need? Do we need the aircon? Do we need the car? Do we need that overseas holiday? I think these are very, very important, questions to ask of ourselves. Okay, and my third point will be to do with disability in Singapore. So people have pointed out these interfaces such as Zoom, teleconferencing. It's created a digital divide because obviously some people can't afford laptops or can't afford broadband connection, etc. Right? But at the same time, also, I would like to indicate that it has been a boon to many people who are disabled, who for the longest time have been telling their employers, I can actually work from home. Yeah. And a lot of businesses were like, no, you can't, in terms of like team building, in terms of like our workplace culture, everyone has to be present for a meeting. But I think we're realizing that, that's not quite true. We can do a lot of things. We can still be productive from home. So I think this is probably an appeal to employers to really think about how you can integrate people with disabilities into your workforce. So I'm just going to give a few examples. Recently, I have a friend who's deaf, and basically I asked her, okay, can you pilot a series of lessons for me so that I can learn sign language over Zoom? And we did this, and the lessons are 1 hour long. And what I realized is that the Zoom infrastructure allows me to communicate with her completely, but not in a verbal manner. So I type my questions, I make my hand signs, and then she looks at it and she corrects it. So obviously this kind of interface has hopefully allowed for some kind of employment opportunity opening. I also have a playwriting student who's blind, and I would have never thought that I would have a blind student going for my playwriting class. But the very fact is that because she does not need to commute, that she can do all these things from home, and she's in a familiar environment, means that, I mean, instructors learn as much from their students as vice versa, right? So I'm learning so much about her growing up years as a blind person, as a person also with limited employment opportunities. Because she was telling me, as a blind person, you either do a masseur or busker or telemarketing, right? So I'm really hoping that as we look at technology, I'm also wary of a kind of techno futurism, but I really do feel, in the case of people with disabilities, this opens up horizons of possibilities. Yeah. And just one more thing, Singapore, we ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in the year 2013. So I definitely think that, all these things are heading and converging in that direction. Very recently, on the 30th of April, in a May Day rally speech by the Prime Minister on television, it was the first time that it was accompanied by sign language interpretation. Yeah. And one would say, oh yeah, these are pandemic conditions. Suddenly you're starting to think about who you're not communicating with, right? So there's this idea of like communicative equality comes to the picture, communicative justice. So that those are promising signs, and I really do hope that we'll have more sign language interpretation, that even that sign language might one day become legitimized as one of Singapore's official languages. We should have 5. Okay, I think that's about it. And I think we'll look through questions later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alfian, and apologies for injecting the neoliberal competitiveness in there. In fact, I think one of the good things about this outbreak is maybe Singaporeans will be less obsessed with league tables when the league tables don't really work in our favor, which would be a good thing. So Alfian has really covered a lot of ground, and I'm really excited by this idea of a migrant workers museum. As Connie pointed out, the Indian Heritage Center, this is before the meeting, it's really brought together many different strains of the culture and history that are not very well known. So I'm a great fan of museums, and I think that like even the Natural History Museum we now have on campus, I mean, it's an amazing experience to learn about the flora and fauna of our region. But to have a museum that you know brings to school children, especially who goes to museums, school kids get taken on trips to museums. So that's really a great way to learn about the people who look after our old people, look after our children, build our roads, clean our homes, and do so much for us. And also, Alfian mentioned this this idea of how you know, technology can break down barriers, even as it does create some. But for people with disability, this is really a game changer, I think. And you know, I've always argued that when we choose to hire somebody, it should be for their skills, their abilities, and their fit with the job, not their ability to negotiate the stairs. You know, and that's been a major barrier for wheelchair users and for people with other disabilities in many buildings and offices and, in Singapore. And so hopefully, you know, if we're all working from home, nobody knows what kind of disability you have, and you can be judged fairly. And that would, I think, be a really a true meritocracy. So moving on, our next presentation is actually going to come from Kirsten Han, who is a Singaporean freelance journalist and curator of the newsletter We the Citizens. Her work often revolves around the themes of social justice, human rights, politics, and democracy. And she's had bylines in publications like The Guardian, The New York Times, Washington Post, and Foreign Policy, which unfortunately has led to her being labeled as a foreign interferer. But that's all the Straits Times' fault because they never gave her a column of her own. So too bad, Warren. She received an honorable mention from the World Justice Project's Anthony Lewis Prize for Exceptional Rule of Law Journalism in 2018, and Human Rights Prize Award for her commentaries on fake news and freedom of expression in 2019. Her essay, Silhouette of Oppression, was published by Epigram Books in 2019, and she's also a founding member of We Believe in Second Chances, a group advocating for the abolition of the death penalty in Singapore. So over to you, Kirsten.
Okay, so thank you for having me for this talk. I was looking down a lot because I'm taking notes, and I have locked out all my cats so that I shouldn't have a BBC Dad situation happening at any point, I hope. They have learned to open doors, so, you know, it's still possible. I think what I'd like to talk about today is to really bring in this idea of politics and how it affects all our lives all the time. So, you know, during this pandemic, there's, you know, already in Singapore before, but especially during the pandemic, there's this sense of like, oh, don't politicize the issue. We should all come together and be SG united, and, you know, we need to like deal with the problems first, and politics can come later. And I think what that neglects to acknowledge is that everything is political, and our responses to everything are informed by our politics. So it's not necessarily, you know, party politics, but just that the way society works and the way that we make decisions, the way we decide how to use resources are all political decisions. So there's actually no getting away from it, right? So this whole idea of, oh, politicizing the issue is seen as being a very negative thing, is seen as, oh, you must have an agenda and we should all avoid politicizing the issue. But there are political elements that need to be considered, and we should get used to adding that into our analysis and our discussions of issues. Because it's not about, you know, Singapore talks as if we have no politics, we are just pragmatic people, you know, we are not like that Trump who like is just playing to his Republican base. You see, that's what politics gets you. But actually, this whole idea of pragmatism is a political sort of position, because who gets to decide what is pragmatic, who gets to decide what is practical? So for example, you know, people saying that, oh, human rights is just idealistic. But I think human rights is practical, because if you don't address human rights, you're going to have other problems down the road, as we have seen with migrant workers, right? We don't address we don't speak to their humanity, we don't take care of their rights, and then we leave them vulnerable to an outbreak, and now we're like, oh no, it's such a big problem, it's going to cost us so much money, and, you know, how are we going to deal with all this? So the idea of politics is really a way of talking about and dissecting how we make these decisions. And so what I thought, you know, is very lacking in Singapore, which I hope that we can we can reflect on while we're all in lockdown and, you know, sitting at home and have time to think about these things, is the idea of politics and power dynamics. Because I've noticed when people are talking about the migrant worker dormitories and the situation, there's been a lot of reflection and consensus that something needs to change. But then a lot of times it also comes back to, oh, but it's Singaporeans who don't want the dorms to be too near their homes, or like Singaporeans don't like migrant workers very much, or are prejudiced, and therefore things can't be better. And so, you know, the government is kind of stuck. And I think this doesn't acknowledge the political and power dynamics in Singapore. It's true that there's a lot of stereotypes and racism and xenophobia and prejudice against migrant workers, but the government has the power to lead from the front. You know, that the government does have the power to say, no, we're going to legislate this as basic standards, and we'll do that. And the government is able to do that and has done that for other things, right? Like, you know, they decided that casinos are really important for the economy, and so they decided that we will do that. They decided that our presidential elections need to have more ethnic diversity, and then they just went and did that, and they can like even change how they count who the first elected president is, right? If it's really important, as Chan Chun Sing said, they will take the political hit if it's right for Singapore. And so why is not improving the standards of migrant worker dormitories right for Singapore, even if Singaporeans don't like migrant workers that much, as we are told, you know? So that's a political decision as well. It's not when people criticize it, it's not about how well or how badly the civil servants on the front line are doing. It's about the political decision that came from the top, because civil servants can only do as much as there is political will to allow them to do, right? There are also civil servants who, you know, we might not hear them publicly, but definitely internally there are civil servants asking for improvements, asking for better ways of doing things, trying to argue for, you know, reform and shifts. But if there's no political will, it can only go so far. And so I think when I was kind of thinking about what to say here, I think it was really this whole idea of power dynamics that is missing from our analysis, and that allows a lot of responsibility to be outsourced. So like, oh, it's the migrant workers who keep socializing. They don't do safe distancing after we told them. Oh, it's the design of the dormitories because it was just not designed well enough. It was Singaporeans who don't want migrant workers in their neighborhoods. It's Singaporeans who don't want to pay more for things, and that's why we can't afford to improve conditions. But there is a power differential in here, right? Migrant workers maybe can't do safe distancing because structurally they are not in environments that allow for that. You know, if Singaporeans can't pay more for it, or unwilling to pay more for, you know, services, then we need to look at why that is. You know, maybe some Singaporeans, it's not about Singaporeans hoarding money. Maybe some Singaporeans already feel stretched about the cost of living, and then that leads us to wider political debate about how our economy is structured, right? So like, if our economy only works if there is a class of migrant workers to be exploited and paid $20 a day to do backbreaking labor, maybe this is an opportunity while all the work sites are shut to rethink that. Do we need, what does it say about our economy that is built on sand like this? You know, it requires a class of people to be constantly exploited before we can operate. And is that really a sort of foundation that we want for our country? Do we feel that this is a secure foundation to be on? You know, this is a good time to think about things like that. And I think my third point, so I'm going to try to keep this short so we can talk together and have questions. It's about how, keeping in mind that these are political decisions, keeping in mind the power dynamics, keeping in mind, you know, who has the power to do things and to bring change. There really needs to be a lot of vigilance post-pandemic, because, you know, now we're talking about, oh, the migrant worker situation must change. And there seems to be this widespread assumption that, oh, because Josephine Teo said that she's given our word that the standards will improve, Lawrence Wong says the design of the dormitories must change, that it will change for the better. But if we aren't talking about the sort of fundamental values and principles and political ideologies that are underpinning the way this problem is approached, I'm not sure that it would change for the better. So today in the Straits Times, there was an op-ed, which of course there was vested interest because it was from this guy who is president of the Floating Solutions, Society for Floating Solutions, where his proposal is to put migrant workers on mega floats where, you know, we can build the dormitories, then we'll build them malls and places to eat and parks. And so like, it'll be a very nice mega float and they will live on the mega float so that they don't have to go to Little India or Lucky Plaza or Golden Mile anymore, where they will interact with Singaporeans. And, you know, they can just stay on those mega floats. And in fact, we can even tow the mega floats around the island so it's closer to their work site. So we can just ferry them onto the work site and then back to the mega float. And they'll just stay there. Weirdly, that was his solution to avoid apartheid, which was to suggest, you know, even more apartheid. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, if we don't, but you know, I think a lot of people might think that his argument is very sound because he says in that way, then if a pandemic like COVID happens again, the migrant workers will not infect locals. They will not be, you know, hanging out with your domestic workers who might bring the infection back to you, even though that's not how it happened this time. And, you know, they will not crowd Little India. And in fact, if we move the migrant workers onto these dorms that on floating platforms, then we can use the land that are currently dormitories and get the true value of the land, he said, the full value of the land, because we can build more like high-tech things there. And it will make Singapore look better also. So this is his approach, right? And I think if we don't question what the fundamental principles are underneath it, it might make a lot of sense logically to people because they're like, yeah, then we can, you know, maximize our economy by like doing more high-level things on the land, and then the workers won't like be crowding the thing. Then the MPs don't have to worry about constituents complaining about their workers. And then, you know, if another pandemic happens, it'll be so much easier to isolate them because they're already isolated. And anyway, he says that there will be malls on the platform, so the islands will be very nice. So, you know, good for the workers also, right? And but then we don't realize that underlying all this very pragmatic sounding proposal is an ideology and a political stance that the economy has to come first. It's a very neoliberal capitalist sort of stance, right? That it's about money and it's about getting the full value out of things. And it's not just things, but people, because we want the workers to work, but we also don't want them to like, we don't want to be responsible for other sort of obligations that we might have. And it's just, you know, these things need to be engaged on the level of politics as well as the level of practicality, right? We are not here to argue with him. Like, you know, the guy who wrote this is an engineer. So who am I to argue with him about the architectural and engineering specs of building a mega float? What I'm arguing with is the whole kind of principle and value of saying that there's a class of people in Singapore who can be shifted onto a mega float. And if we don't have this sort of more political and social kind of critique, then we're forever going to be talking about, you know, technocratic things of, okay, but what if the float was slightly connected to Singapore via a bridge? Is that less apartheid? Or, you know, what if, you know, we did it this way or that way? And we shouldn't always be kind of stuck on this level of discourse. I think there should be a deeper level of discourse. I remember a friend who was talking to me about the first democracy classroom. So I facilitate democracy classrooms, but there was a friend who had done previous ones before. And he said one of his first democracy classrooms that he facilitated, he kind of brought out this hypothetical situation of Singapore wanting to build a nuclear power plant. And he was hoping to get Singaporeans to discuss, you know, around this idea of nuclear energy in Singapore. But because he proposed this hypothetical situation that started with the Singapore government has said that they would like to build a nuclear power plant, he realized that immediately Singaporeans took that hypothetical scenario. And the whole discussion was about how do we execute the building of this power plant? Because the government has said they want it. So we as Singaporeans, we just all talk about how to execute. So, you know, it's kind of like how my parents used to joke in Chinese that the People's Action Party is that, you know, because in Chinese it's the 人民行动党, right? So it's People's Action Party, and the joke was that they decide and then the people take action. And I think this is really dangerous because then we don't ask deeper questions about who we are, why we are doing this, and what the value is, and what our principles are, how it reflects us as a society, and what the long-term impacts on this society can be. You know, the long-term, a floating island for workers might sound very good practically, but at the end of the day, it perpetuates this idea that there's a class of people in Singapore who don't need to be recognized as, you know, humans just like us, don't need to be treated like us. It's dehumanizing. And it's this sort of dehumanizing kind of attitude that led us to this point in the first place, right? That migrant workers are considered separate from the people. And so we take care of the people during COVID and we brought in all these measures, and then we forgot about the dorms until it was too late. If we don't talk about that fundamental principle of not caring about people as people, regardless of where they come from and how much they make in wages and what visa status they're on, then shifting it onto a floating island is just replicating the problem, except now they're on a floating island. And I think, you know, that's why I worry about that. Like, things will change post-pandemic, but not change in the meaningful and deep-rooted ways that they need to change. And so I think I would argue then that we need this sort of political awareness. And I understand why it's difficult to have this political awareness now, because they're not taught in schools, right? School teaching is also extremely depoliticized in very unhelpful ways that lead to ways in which we don't even fully understand global events with the political element. You know, when I moved to the UK to study, I realized that people were laughing at me because I thought that the Troubles in Northern Ireland was a religious harmony issue, because when I learned it in school, it was so depoliticized. I didn't realize it was about political power and control. I was like, it's just that Protestants and Catholics don't like each other. So if there's more religious harmony, it would be fine in Ireland. And everyone looked at me like I was crazy. So I think I would just leave it at that, you know, these are things that we really need to think about, that we really need to reintroduce into society in Singapore.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. I think that's a really nice summary of how, you know, politics actually permeates every single part of our daily life. I mean, the fact that, you know, so many of us don't drive, maybe because of a political decision that's made to privilege driving to a certain category. You know, we've all seen that video of the Fast and Furious people getting so shocked at the cost of cars in Singapore. And it's not just that, but, you know, the way we deal with migrant workers and see them as parts of machinery rather than as individuals. And in fact, another patient I saw just in the last week, he's a 22-year-old from South India, and he was in hospital with pneumonia. And the nurses came up to him and said, oh, you know, your mom called the ward and she wanted to know how you were doing. And he said, don't tell her I've got the COVID. And I said to him, look, you know, if you don't tell her you've got the COVID, she knows you're in hospital. She may have thought you broke your neck or something terrible. I said, you just got to tell her. And then he looked at me, you know, and he's just 22 years old. He's a young guy. And, you know, he just didn't think about these things. And these sort of, you know, encounters with individuals, which I'll be honest, I hardly ever encounter migrant workers. It's only just in the last few weeks, with so many of them getting admitted with the COVID disease, that I've had a chance to really interact with them and to sort of see where they're coming from and how their perceptions of disease are so similar and yet so different from Singaporeans in so many different ways. So thank you very much, Kirsten. And our final speaker for this panel is Mr. Tan Hao. Tan Hao is a playwright and arts activist. He's also the author of a children's adventure series, the Sengkang Snoopers. He blogs at tantanhao.wordpress.com. And so, Tan Hao, I'm looking forward to hearing your views.
So what should we do after this pandemic is over? I'm glad that Connie, Alfian, and Kirsten have dealt with the big picture, civil society, the arts and disability, and the necessity of putting politics in the equation. So I'm going to do something very simple to offer three very small and concrete proposals about how we can improve things after this pandemic. They're all related to the question of inequality and the inequities, the unfairness, the unjustness that result from these inequities. First of all, our 1 million low-wage migrant workers who are our domestic helpers, cleaners and construction labor, where do we even start tackling that question? Of course, we should improve their living conditions, which the pandemic have made painfully evident. My proposal today, however, is a more fundamental change. Namely, we should get rid of the gross inequality in power between these guest workers and their employers and government. This inequality, I believe, lies at the root of many of the problems that has led to the dormitories to become hotbeds of infection. Imagine that you have from the Philippines or Myanmar, India, China, or Bangladesh, and you have borrowed an enormous amount of money, $8,000, $9,000, which is many, many times the monthly, not to say yearly income. At present, and you borrow the money, you come to work here. At the present moment, what happens is that you can have your work permit summarily taken away at the whim of your boss. So there's no appeal. And if this happens before you have worked the years needed to pay off your loan, it means that you'll be forced to return home with a potentially life-burdening debt. I think to subject anyone to this kind of precarity is grossly unjust. The worker's vulnerability also engenders other injustices because she or he is afraid that any attempt to address them, to speak up, might end with them on the next flight home. And with more voice, and agency for them, the sometimes very poor conditions that have been allowed to happen will not have continued, for example. And I also like to add, don't put too much faith in the free market, in the private sector. My second suggestion is that it's about school children from low-income families. The pandemic has exposed the fact that many of our children do not have the means to afford what we consider first world country of ours, and in this internet age, to be a basic student's toolkit to be part of the 21st century education that government has called our education system. And I refer to what many of us take for granted, a computer and broadband. And this inequality has a snowball effect. Poor students with insufficient material and social resources who start primary school behind and will eventually end up even further back by the end of their school years. So we have seen that for this home-based learning that have been implemented during the circuit breaker, the government has had to scramble to find 12,000 tablets and laptops to loan to the families. And telcos have come forward to give free data connection. Civil society groups such as Engineering Good have also stepped in. My proposal is simple. The Ministry of Education must provide such fundamental tools. And the equally important ancillaries that we must not forget, such as software and repair and service, for free to all students who need it. For free. And do it with no questions asked. Consider this digital package the basic income equivalent for education. Of course, there'll be a minority who abuse it, as in any system, right? But we should get rid of the mindset which we often have in Singapore, that because of a bad 1 to 2% of the people, we deny the 89 or 99% the benefit that comes from it. And the government already spends on each student $12,000 a year per primary child and $15,000 per secondary student. These are 2018 figures. And even if we are sufficiently generous to provide this free basic digital toolkit for poor students, it should not add very much to the total cost of education for the government. My third suggestion concerns those among us who can't afford to feed ourselves or our families properly. My proposal is simple. No one who is at fault should go hungry in Singapore. In fact, I would say that even if they are at fault, our consciences should not allow us to let them go hungry. Some may be surprised that there are people who go hungry in Singapore, but a feature by Channel News Asia called Going Hungry in Singapore, a Cheap Food Paradise, shows that it happens. Already in normal times, where charities like Willing Hearts and Free Food for All to partially fill some of these needs. In COVID times, grassroots efforts have also sprung up. And strangely enough, this aspect of inequality has not really surfaced much during the pandemic, like other issues. I'm most concerned about the children, the future generation. Being minors, they are extra vulnerable. Thus, we have the additional duty of care towards them. I further propose that we have a simple government pledge, a simple pledge by society and government to start with. No child hungry. No child hungry. And in a rich country like ours, having enough to eat should not be dependent on the vagaries of charity and should not entail the indignities often induced from being a recipient of charity or applying for it. Eating adequately should be a right, and it should be our collective. That is the government's responsibility, right? And of course, government will act only if citizens ask for it, like Connie has pointed out. And let's not make the poor go through the hoops to get help, especially this very basic one. Vouchers, free school lunches, or other ideas can be tried. I'm not really expert. I'm not expert at all. And if it's really true that this is a small problem, as government has said, then it shouldn't cost too much. But even if it does, we should do it. So to end, I wish to add that these problems are not new. What's happened is that the coronavirus has merely brought them into focus, brought them to the foreground. Now that has happened, we are duty-bound to solve them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tan Hao. I think you've really hit the nail on the head as well. This whole issue of inequality, which has been in the conversation for the last year or so after Yu Yan's book, but somehow it seems to have faded a little bit because everybody thinks that we're all in misery together, whereas actually some people are in a lot more misery than others. You know, this whole idea of working from home, though, is very much a white collar thing. Because I cannot imagine, you know, how can a hawker work from home? You know, it's really, really hard. You've got all the delivery companies who are just charging an arm and a leg that comes out of the hawker's profit. And similarly for many blue-collar jobs. So we've had some good questions that have come on the chat, and I'm going to begin with the first one. The first one is actually from Samuel Sim. He's asked this question: what are the panelists' views on the intersectional nature of issues that affect our time? And what more could be done to address this, for example, arts and migrant workers and the environment, and make such interdisciplinary engagements more inclusive, democratic, and participatory? And on a similar vein, he continues, the government has recently been organizing citizens' work groups and juries. Do you have any thoughts on this? And does civil society have a role in doing something similar? So I think this question can be addressed to everybody on the panel. So I'm going to start, do it the way we ran the presentations. So Connie, would you like to be first to take on this question?
The one about
intersectional nature. Yeah.
And yeah, but one of the things that I have interdisciplinary engagement, much more democratic and participatory. One of the points that I raised is that we have to do that. You know, and I think somebody said about separate juries and separate organizations won't help. We have to work together. And for this to happen, the government has to change its attitude about people outside of government, in civil society, and reach out for their expertise. So I really think that they should work together. All the various sectors should work together. Arts communities have really engaged with migrant workers already. I know I was part of that too, that we have included writers, for instance, in our discussion groups. So that is already taking place, but that is not enough because that kind of engagement is with just a small group of people. It's not with the wider community, and it's wider community that we have to address.
Good
Have I
question.
answered the question?
Alfian, you're someone who's trying to bring the arts to the wider
Sure.
community. I
Yes.
think.
So I think a lot of these things have to be actually self-initiated. I don't think you should just wait around to have someone matchmake you. So for example, like last month, I had a really wonderful session with some young climate activists, and I forgot to give them a shout out just now. So it's basically SG Climate Rally, as well as Singapore Climate Youth for Climate Action. Yeah, and then we had this really wonderful meeting, a kind of webinar where I presented on how theatre performance in Singapore have been exploring environmental themes. I also looked at, so all these things are connected, right? So tree planting ceremonies as a kind of performance, but also like there's this wonderful picture of Goh Keng Swee chopping down a tree in Pulau Bukom in 1960, so as to inaugurate the building of a refinery, right? So that's also another kind of performance, and I feel that's a much more honest performance in Singapore than our tree planting rituals. That performance of chopping down the tree, I think, says a lot about our own carbon footprint and our emissions, etc. So definitely, I think these things have to be self-initiated. And I think most of the times people are friendly. Just look for the experts who are in academia or civil society. What I do is I kind of like send cold call emails to people who I think I don't know whether they consider this harassment, but I'm doing a play about history. I will knock on the doors, so to speak, of a few historians and try to engage them. So yeah, I think it has to be self-initiated. Yeah. That's it from
Kirsten?
Yeah, I think definitely, self-initiated, definitely, because you can't really force people to engage intersectionally if it's not a choice that they themselves make. But I think to go back to politics and power dynamics, I think one of the barriers towards more intersectional engagement with groups like migrant workers and the barriers to integrating them more is how precarious they are. So as Tan Hao said, they could be repatriated at any point. So there are definitely, like public forums about migrant workers issues that we should have migrant workers speaking. But then it comes in this kind of security consideration of if they are so publicly in a huge public platform and they say things like my employer is withholding my wages, or my dormitory is terrible and MOM is not doing enough, are we then exposing them to risk? So that's why sometimes activists end up speaking for them, because we collect these views, we anonymize them, and then we put them out when actually they shouldn't be. They should just be directly communicated. But the reason that it's not more intersectional is because there's this worry about their position, if they will get repercussions for saying things to the media, they'll get repercussions for joining, if SDP did a forum on migrant workers, will all the migrant workers who join an opposition party panel be marked? They would worry about these things. And so first we would
we can't have foreigners on our panels. So.
Yeah, I think also cannot, right? So how to intersectional? So we need to remove these barriers, like it's a real problem. I think with the juries and citizen workshops, I think it's great that the government is doing them. The government should be doing them, but the key is how meaningful and genuine these consultations are, because we can have a lot of consultations, but without openness and transparency about where these consultations are going, then it's hard for people to have trust in them. So, you know, people need to not just submit feedback, but they need to know how the feedback is dealt with. They need to know the rationale behind like why you accept some feedback and you don't accept other feedback, so that there's trust in this exercise.
Yeah.
So one thing that's going on at the moment is MCI has opened calls for consultation about the Personal Data Protection Act.
Right.
And so there's been consultation ongoing for a few years already, but previous consultations were a bit more general, right? So this consultation is specifically the wording of the amendments that they want to introduce into the law. The consultation period is only 2 weeks long. So if you want to submit feedback, you only have 5 days left. It ends at 5 p.m. on the 28th. And while, you know, they say, oh, we've already done like years of consultation before, but consulting generally on the idea of personal data protection is very different from consulting specifically on the wording that is actually going to be in the law.
Yeah.
And I would argue that the consultation about the actual wording is probably one of the most important parts, because once it's in the law, it's very hard to shift. So, you know, is it good enough?
Those are all really good points.
Yeah.
Although, you know, I think the experience of you and PJ in providing feedback to the government has kind of deterred some people. So that's also
yeah.
partly,
I was upset about that, because like beyond the personal inconvenience, it's really annoying that it would deter people when actually more people should be joining these things.
Yeah. Well, Tan Hao, what's your take on this?
On the citizen workshops, I would submit that the civil society or groups are doing it. They are, in a way, ongoing workshops about critical issues affecting the country. How well they do it and all that we can set aside. But I think that's what they do. They come together, they think hard about problem, and they try to solve it. On the intersectional issues, I would contend as an artist myself, a writer myself, that, you know, despite the, well, you know, civil society is atomized, like most of us are, and that's the strategy that the government has done. It sort of doesn't like civil society's groups to come together and coalesce and then become even more powerful. Become powerful, not that we're powerful at all. But I would submit that the arts is an area where there's a lot of intersectionality going on. Alfian has cited his work with the migrant workers. And then there are many people working, artists, there are artists working in prisons, in hospitals with the handicapped. And then Post-Museum did ongoing art project about Bukit Brown, the necessary stage doing with the elderly, their drama workshop, and then the substation of which I'm a part, doing it with the Heritage Society. So all this is going on. What's the problem is that when arts groups try to do that, the government say, you are arts group, you shouldn't be involved in these political issues. And in the past, we have been told off or penalized for trying to politicize issues which are should be outside the artistic domain.
Okay, very good. I think you're right. And you know, there's the specter of 1987, which sort of hangs over any attempt to have arts groups, people working with migrant workers and civil society. But you know, I think the reality is that 1987 was some time ago, and it was in a different era. We didn't have the social media, and you know, I'm an optimist, and I don't think the government can get away with what they did in 1987 today. And so you know, and the fact that we keep reminding them about 1987 is a good sign in that. So I think that sort of will keep them on their toes. And that actually brings us to the second question.
Well,
Connie, you want to say something? Yes?
Yeah, I just want to comment on what Tan Hao said about civil society, that of course government does discourage civil society groups and organizations to come together, but they have, you know, over the
TWC is an example.
And as a result of that, there is a network of people, they know each other and they can work together on common issues. One of the problems though is, and I have said this before, is that we don't have enough political education The
Right.
civil society, even when they come together, they talk about empowering each other and working across various issues. But we are still too nervous about talking about political issues. And I know that I am told, and I know for experience, I mean, it's not you're working against your constitution. The constitution doesn't allow. The group's constitution doesn't allow. But as Kirsten said, we have to widen that definition of politics.
Yeah,
And
and
we have to do
again,
that.
this is one of the things that that makes me a bit optimistic about this pandemic. Is the government made a 180-degree turn on this whole issue of masks, even though the scientific data were not 100% convincing. But it's just that there was so much groundswell that we went from, don't use a mask unless you're sick. It's bad for the public if you use a mask. And now, of course, we've gone to the other extreme where it's mandatory, even after you finish jogging, to put on a mask and things like that. So I think, the government does respond to, but it's what it does respond to that's the question. And so that leads us on to the second question from Lo Swan Leng, who asks, how do you confirm or ensure civil service has good governance and proper checks and balances? And maybe Connie, you want to address that question. Can
you repeat that question? How do you?
Yeah, can we get the question up on screen? So it's, how do you confirm or ensure that the civil service gets good governance and proper checks and balances? Now, this is slightly different. I'm not sure whether the questioner is referring to politicians or whether, and I guess this is also the role of civil society. So what's the role of civil society as a, you sort of made the distinction between political parties and civil society, but how do you see their complementary or differing roles in the governance question?
One of the things that we have seen during this pandemic is this whole problem of the foreign workers, the migrant foreign workers, and the fact that TWC2 has been working and has been lobbying the government, and they have been warned about this overcrowding of dormitories. So why hasn't the civil servants responded to that? I would speculate that the culture of the civil service comes from the politician who is leading it.
Right.
So the MOA minister, I feel very sorry for Josephine Teo, really, because she's been dumped with this mess by ministers who were there because this has been a problem that has been building up over the years. She's now caught in this trap of having to resolve a problem that has been there for a long time. And I think the culture comes from the politicians, not the civil servants. There are lots of civil servants who are open to civil society suggestions and recommendations, but they can't act.
Right, no, that's true. Tan Hao, any comments?
Well, I think, if I can put the civil service together with the political leadership as one block, because in Singapore there's been the contention, and I think it's quite true that there is very little separation. I would say that you just need more checks and balances, and the checks and balances come in terms of thriving media, right? Opposition party, like Constance has said, and then you need civil society, which looks at specific problems. And then, once you have that, then there will be a more open debate. Now, because the debate has been, the lead has been kept on this, on the debates in all these different domains, there isn't enough to, for the government as well as the people to consider what are the alternatives. And then we can get stuck in a very set path and nobody
then it becomes confrontational, which is supposed to be a bad thing.
Exactly.
Rather than, where there's a certain degree of mutual respect and understanding.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to the third and fourth questions because they're related. So the third question is from Ding Ding Ng, who asks, how can we be an inclusive society if we don't integrate migrant workers with the people? And the fourth question is from Surendra Kumar. He asked the question whether the SDP would consider addressing the problems with the government's policies on low-wage migrant worker labor. And the answer to that is yes. We've always argued for a minimum wage, which will deal with this issue, because the minimum wage that applies across the board will mean that there's no advantage to getting a migrant worker who's willing to work for less. But his question goes on to say that many of the concerns affecting low-wage migrant workers also affect low-wage local workers. So can we start calling both groups the working class? Separating these groups is done by design through the different policies. But if we look at the issues, there are so many convergences: food insecurity, living conditions, chronic debt, low wages. Maybe Kirsten, you want to start, and then Alfian, you can pick up on that later. And anyone else can chip in. Yeah, Kirsten, you're muted, I think.
We talk about migrant workers as a group a lot, as if they have always been and are naturally distinct. And I think there's actually, you know, we talk about them like that now because the policies have made them distinct, but what is the reason behind them being distinct? And I think, yeah, you know, Kumar is right. They should just be the working class together with low-wage Singaporeans. You know, the fact that we also talk about them as distinct from other immigrants or migrants is also, you know, something that maybe we should rethink. You know, why are work permit holders so segregated in so many ways? You know, physically, rhetorically, by policy, and they are treated as if they need to be managed as if they're a different category of humans. And I think we need to rethink that. I don't think we can truly, you know, this idea that they are just temporary workers, I think needs to be nipped in the bud, because I've met workers who have been here for 15 years, 16 years, you know, they are not temporary workers. And even if they're only here for 2 years, that doesn't mean our responsibility for them and their rights and their well-being is any less. So I think we should just treat people.
Yep, I totally agree. Alfian, your comments on that?
So maybe I'll tackle that one by Ding Ding Eng, right? So how can we be an inclusive society if we don't integrate? So you know, I think that hits the nail completely on the head. The thing is, we have a National Integration Council in Singapore, right? They were set up in the year 2009. But interestingly, its focus is only on new citizens. So I'm wondering, you know, what if we try to expand its scope? Because this one, you know, they have a community integration fund, and to support organizations in implementing ground-up integration initiatives. And I'm wondering, what if you really expand this to looking at integrating migrant workers? What kinds of activities can you create with them, for them? Because I think some of the attitudes, like for example, not wanting a foreign worker dormitory in proximity to our residential areas, is precisely because there are these barriers of understanding, right, between us and them. So I really do feel that these are initiatives that hopefully will change attitudes, and then those kinds of attitudes might push legislation and hopefully policy in the future.
Can I suggest that
sure,
that for migrant workers, we should open a path to permanent residency as well as citizenship for people who have been here long enough and, you know, have committed so much of their lives here.
Right.
After all, I mean, my parents wouldn't have made it if, you know, the criteria that's being used now. And yeah, I mean, this whole thing about immigrant society, I really believe in that. And it's not just for a certain set of privileged immigrants. You know?
But I don't know. I mean, just to be a little bit cynical, right? I would also say that a transient workforce that you can keep docile because of the fact that they have very little political rights, including, say, voting rights, and that you can just deport at, let's say, the slightest infraction, actually works to the benefit of the state, if I'm going to be really cynical about it, you know, right?
And I agree with you.
So obviously there's this like conflict between like doing what is right, the ethics of it, versus, I suppose, very cold political / economic calculations.
Yeah, Connie wants to say something.
Yeah, wasn't there an incident a couple of weeks ago when I think it was 20 foreign workers who were deported because they were not wearing masks?
Right, exactly, yeah.
And then you have a lot of other people, expatriates, who are not wearing masks. Do we deport them as well?
No, but I think, you know, I think that's, Yeah, there's always a danger that if you treat one group of people badly, then that's not really a good reason to treat everybody
No,
badly.
that's true. That's
Yeah.
true. That's true.
But you know what I think really needs
Can
to...
I just go on, Paul?
Yeah, go ahead, please, Connie. Yeah.
One is, I think, whether it's domestic work or construction work, there's this lack of professional acceptance of their work being valuable.
Right.
And I always worry when people talk about domestic workers as they are part of the family. They're not part of the family. You know, they are there to do work.
Work. Yeah, they're workers.
Yes,
They're
you
there for a
appreciate
job.
the work, and you follow the rules.
Right.
It's the same thing with migrant workers.
Right.
They're there to do the job.
Right.
And you pay them well to do the job, and you
Exactly.
treat them well to do the job. So if you accept that value of the work and the value of the person, you won't have... Something else that bothers me is also because a lot of these migrant workers are from South Asia. And I'm wondering whether racism has anything to do with the way we treat them.
Yeah, well, you know, there's the weird thing about Singapore's law is that the job you can do depends on your nationality. You know, you can only be a shipyard worker if you belong to a certain nationality. You can only be a construction worker if you belong to a certain nationality. If you're Venezuelan, you can't be a shipyard worker or construction worker. And they've never given a proper explanation as to why. You know, and that really annoys me.
It all goes up to the government policies.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I just like to add that, you know, where there is prejudice and stereotypes, you know, it is on the government, on the state and the government. And even the UN has said this. So for example, if we say, oh, Singaporeans have prejudices and stereotypes and racism against migrant workers, then it is on the state and the government to take action to combat that. Mm-hmm. So it's not good enough to just say, oh, we cannot move because Singaporeans don't approve of LGBT people or they don't approve of migrant workers. Then the next question is, then what is the state doing to correct those views? And, you know, it's been brought up in international stages, like with CEDAW and everything. If there is prejudice in your society, then it is on the state as well to attempt to at least have initiatives that try to address this, rather than sit back and wait until like society somehow corrects itself.
But you know, again, I think as members of, and you know, for a long time I was a member of civil society before I was forced to quit and join a political party. You know, we sort of have part of a role to play in this, because the narrative is that, you know, we get cheap houses, we get cheap rides on MRTs because we have migrant workers who we are exploiting. And if we didn't, we'd have to pay more, and that would hurt the average Singaporean. But that is a completely false narrative, you see. And I think Terry made that comment in the chat, that essentially the fact that, you know, we're paying the workers less doesn't benefit the average Singaporean. In fact, it hurts the average Singaporean, because it means that the average Singaporean is in a race to the bottom in terms of how much his employer is willing to pay him or her. The only person who benefits is the guy on top, who's, you know, the shareholders. You've heard about how much profits these dormitory operators are making. And I think that's part of the educational role as civil society that we need to really make people aware of, that you know, it's not us against them at the bottom, but it's there's this famous story that gets told, you know, somebody sitting around a table with 20 cookies, a businessman, a worker, and a foreigner, and a migrant worker. And the businessman takes 18 cookies and he tells the worker, he says, see, that foreign worker is going to take that one of yours. You know, and that essentially happens all the time in Singapore, because and it's not just in Singapore, it's all this entire neoliberal world that we live in particular in the Anglo-Saxon countries, see, where there's a dominant view that you know, you can pit the migrant against the low-wage local person. So I think you know, we've got a part to play in that, and it's really good to get civil society moving on that. Now there's a ton of questions, so I'm going to cut everyone off from that one, and I'm going to move to the next one. So there are two questions in a row. The first is from George Teo, and he says, our climate is slowly but surely damaged by the government for overbuilding BTOs, condos, and buildings. Comments, please. So this is on overbuilding. The second one is from Yong Feng Si. who comments that actually South Korea has led the way for Asia in pledging to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050 as part of a Green New Deal law. As we move forward from the pandemic, do you see an opportunity to push for such sweeping changes to move us beyond the pursuit of growth to a more inclusive society that also cares for our future generations and ecosystems? And I'm going to let Alfian start off on that.
Sure. Okay, so that first comment about overbuilding, right? I just think that that's maybe one contributory factor, but I really do think it's a big issue is regarding emissions, right? So we've signed the Paris Agreement, for example, in I think 2016, where we've committed to actually try to lower global temperature, or at least maintain it at a certain level. But I think a lot of it has to do with like greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of it has to do with our electricity generation, and also this huge issue. I'll move on to that second question, an opportunity for such sweeping changes regarding decarbonization and divestment from fossil fuels, right? This is a huge issue in Singapore because we do have a petrochemical industry in Singapore. So Jurong Island accounts for a large part of our economy. At least 1/3 of our manufacturing output is the petrochemical industries. So definitely, I think it will take a huge systemic radical change in how we kind of restructure our economy for that to happen. But I do not think it's impossible to do that. I just think there needs to be a lot of dialogue and not, dismissing a lot of young people who care about climate as so-called idealistic radical greenies, for example, right? Their voice really matters in these conversations because, as I mentioned before, it is their future we're talking about.
Good.
Yeah.
Kirsten?
Yeah, I think, just to add, it is, a matter of political will. It is, nobody says that it's easy. I think one thing that's always kind of said in response is that, oh, all you people are not very realistic because it's not that easy. And it's just like, nobody said it was easy. But if there is political will, Singapore has been known to get very difficult things done. And so I think that's definitely one thing.
Okay.
For the overbuilding, I think
Sorry,
it's just,
yeah, go ahead.
For the overbuilding, I think it's just a discussion of how we structure our economy and how we are kind of running towards growth and prioritizing growth all the time.
Yeah, I think that overbuilding is a bad thing because I think King Soon has actually put out a lot of points about how ventilation, is an issue when you open the window and like in my place, I open the window, I look into my neighbor's apartment. And so the tendency is to keep the window closed most of the time. And that, creates a vicious cycle because then you're forced to use the air conditioning because there's no cross ventilation, and you just open the windows just to air the room when you're sure that the neighbor has gone out. So there's a lot of interlinked issues on this. If any of you have anything else to say, if not, I'm going to move on to the next question. Yes, Alfian, is it? No. Okay, so moving on. So the next question is actually from Christine May Yi. If post-COVID-19, more overseas workers in all sectors are required due to Singaporeans preferring to avoid certain jobs, please share the SDP's position on this. And she's rephrased this question. There's a high possibility that foreign labor is required. So panelists, please share your views on Singaporeans not being willing to take certain jobs. This is the question that always comes up. Singaporeans don't want to take certain jobs. That's why we are dependent on migrant labor.
If I may make a quick comment on that, Paul.
Yes, please, Tan Hao.
If you pay me $10,000 to sweep the street, I will do it.
That's right.
Right. I mean, and the classic example of very difficult, almost, very back-breaking and under very bad conditions where people are willing to work for high pay is in the oil industry, where those people who work in oil rigs, the conditions are extremely bad. But yes, because you pay them high enough, right? So the problem is that we want Singaporeans to work as construction workers, and want to pay them $1,000, $1,500, and whatever that is, right? Why are people in the Western countries willing to be plumbers. It's not because Singaporeans are not willing to be plumbers, because overseas plumbers get paid very high, get paid very highly. So
That's right.
So there's a fallacy to think that, you know, once you offer the job at whatever price, when there are no takers, people don't like the job because of the job. It's largely because of the price you are willing to pay for them.
And the respect, right? So like plumbers in other countries, plumbers and builders are seen as skilled labor, and they are valued and they are given respect for the work that they do. Not here where they're labeled as unskilled workers. You know, I met a migrant worker and I said, what do you do on the site? And he says, I do soil testing to make sure that the foundation is really firm enough to build the building on. And I was like, that doesn't sound very unskilled to me. It sounds quite important. But he's considered unskilled labor and he's paid like $20 a day. And that's, you know, Singaporeans don't want to do that because, to be honest, the amount of money that we pay a migrant worker to do this labor, a Singaporean cannot feed their families.
Yes.
And so why would they do it?
So just to add to that, I think, yeah.
That's the biggest problem, you know, not being paid enough. How can a Singaporean live on the kind of wages these workers are paid?
Right.
You can't.
Yeah. So I think the pandemic also has sort of like illustrated what exactly are the essential jobs in society to keep society running, and how much actually we are underpaying for these jobs, you know. Yeah.
Why haven't we mechanized these jobs? Why are we so labor intensive?
That's exactly the point. You know, I was in Australia at a conference at the end of last year, and there was a construction site next to the hotel. And there was one worker there with 5 machines, and he had his boombox and he was playing his music and he was running the 5 machines. And, you know, he knocks off on the dot at 5 o'clock. He has his, and he goes and has his beer. And, you know, that's what happens in places where there is a minimum wage.
Yeah.
But I think the next question from Terry is actually linked to that. He says, you know, it's not one thing or the other. He says many workers are retrenched because they cost more than foreign workers, and foreign workers are willing to do more unpleasant jobs because they have no right to complain to their boss. And he says, if you're an employer, who would you prefer to hire? Locals who are more expensive and can complain, or foreign workers who are cheaper and know you can sack them at any time without any consequences? And you know, that's the reality, is that the work permit can be cancelled by the employer at any time without any recourse and without any reason. So I think that's related to that. Any of you would like to comment on that?
I think there's one other issue, that these policies also trap them in very vulnerable situations, even, you know, beyond just the work. So I once interviewed a domestic worker who had been quite badly abused by her previous employer. And so by the time I met her, she was already she was staying in a shelter because she had an ongoing case that MOM was actually investigating, right? That she had been abused by her employer. And and because she was being investigated, so MOM had accepted that it was a valid case, that they were looking into it. And so she was granted the permission to change employers and seek new employment in Singapore so that she can continue working and earning income. But what she said was, because of the policy that you brought up earlier, Paul, that people from certain nationalities, we call them source countries, people from certain source countries can only work in certain industries. She was basically told, you are allowed to change employer, but only to another employer to continue being a domestic worker. And she's so traumatized from her previous abuse. She said, I don't want to go back into someone's home, because then it's like a lottery again, right? What if this employer is also mean? She's like, I can speak English, I can wait tables, I can clean tables at Coffee Bean. Because on her day off, she goes around Lucky Plaza and Orchard, and she sees all these Coffee Beans and Starbucks all have signs saying that they're looking for workers. They're getting labor shortages, but she's not allowed to get those jobs because she's not from the right source country. And she asked me why, and I just couldn't answer her. And so we have this system that traps people in situations where they are very vulnerable, and they continue to be exploited over and over again. There are migrant workers who have come to Singapore 4 times and been cheated 3 of those times, and then they come back again because they hope this time it will be better. Maybe I'll find a better employer, and then finally I will be able to offset all this other debt. And so I think this situation that Terry brought up is very pertinent. We have a group of people in Singapore that are very, very easily to bully and take advantage of. And because they are so easy to bully and take advantage of, it's just the easier way out for employers. Why, bother with Singaporeans who would have, different sorts of rights and avenues of access?
Okay, the next question is actually from Seikla BM. What is your view on how the fast-paced changes can affect our youth and their future and them as individuals? What's your view on graduate unemployment and underemployment, or even youth unemployment as a whole? So, I think we are facing a recession, and there's a very high likelihood that, I know people have been retrenched already. A lot of the part-time workers have been let go. So this is something that is the near-term reality of what's going to happen after the pandemic. We can't all become artists. Even if we do, I don't know whether we're going to be able to feed our families. So maybe we start with Tan Hao.
Actually, I know very little about this. So I know all I can say is that it's a hard time. This reminds me of the late 80s when there's a huge recession, and then we're all, friends my age, were all going around in despair. I think that there's a lot of psychological stress for them. And I think that we should keep an eye on that.
Right, fair enough. Connie?
Well, I don't have a solution either, but one of the things that we do have to look at a safety net.
Right.
A safety net for people who are poor, who and also for people who are in between jobs and have lost jobs. So we have to rethink this whole social policy. Really, this pandemic has shown up so many problems, and the government can't just take from Treasury and give us like Pioneer Generation and Merdeka Generation and tweak here and there. They have to look at the whole policy of how do you support Singaporeans, including those who are most vulnerable. It's not that they're reluctant to do that, but they're reluctant to change their attitude.
Right. Yeah, I think that's unfortunately part of the DNA, of the ruling party at the moment. And so I'm going to make a shameless plug for the SDP's policy, and we have 4 yeses and 1 no. And the second yes is actually retrenchment benefits. So we've argued that there should, and we're not the only ones who have argued for retrenchment insurance, but we've argued that under the SDP's Restart program, if a worker is retrenched, the government pays 75% of his or her last drawn salary for the first 6 months, 50% for the second 6 months, and 25% for the final 6 months, capped at the median wage. So the idea, and this is done in many, many countries, and these are not struggling countries, these are high-income countries. Because what that does is it gives people the reassurance. I think it was Connie who talked about safety net, you see. People keep lamenting the fact that Singaporeans don't have entrepreneurs, they don't have people who are willing to stick their necks out in business.
That's not true.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it's true at all, but I hear that all the time. In fact, when I spoke to the principal of Yale NUS, I asked him how come the government spends so much money bringing Yale NUS to Singapore, and he said, well, they had done their sums, and someone told them Singapore would never have a Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs unless they have a liberal arts college, which I found really amusing.
That's how we started. That's how we started.
Right.
We had so many entrepreneurs who have now become millionaires, but they were small business people.
Right. No, but the small business people are being shut out by, so many mom and pop stores are being shut out by the big supermarkets, the big chains. And again, it's not just a Singaporean phenomenon, it's happening all over the world, especially in the Anglo-Saxon countries with the neoliberal kind of philosophies.
I think just this idea of like self-reliance and resilience needs to be because definitely I remember when I was in school that we were given this narrative, right? Like if you study very hard, then you do well for your PSLE, you will go to a good secondary school that will lead to a good JC, that will lead to a good university, that will lead to a good job, then you buy your BTO and then like you're set for life, right? And I think my generation is finding that this is not possible. At my age, my parents had a flat and like were having kids already, and I can't even imagine being able to afford a down payment for a flat. And it's not Singapore specific, right? It's across the world. You know, people are saying like millennials are buying buying too many avocados, but it's kind of like, I can stop buying avocados, so I don't even buy avocados, but I still cannot afford to put on the down payment. You know, it's not so. So I think this, but in Singapore, because we have this idea of resilience and meritocracy, then when young people come out into the job market, especially now, if they come out now and they find that they can't really get employment, or they're underemployed, or they're not able to achieve that sort of salary level that they expected that they were going to get, we need to be very careful that our national rhetoric doesn't blame them for this. No, it is not their individual failing.
But also, I think young people, Kirsten, has high expectations. I think we have to have a general, educated, well-educated public, citizens who are prepared to do any kind of job, you know, as long as it pays them well enough to lead a good life. Because, because elsewhere you can be a graduate, but you can also do any kind of, I mean, it's possible, you know, it's possible. I go to the market and there was this young man who was selling eggs. But he was sitting for an exam and he had this very thick textbook. So I asked him, what are you doing? He said, oh, he's a student, engineering student, but he was helping his father. And you can see that lots of young people are doing that, taking over from their father's business and helping out, you know. That is a change of attitude. You see, what happened was, this is going back to history, when we came up at university, this was the oyster. Everything was possible. We could all get jobs, you know, and they became very rich. All those civil servants who were first generation civil servants became very rich. And the children expected, they're starting from the top of their parents' achievement,
right.
You know, and you can't go on like that. How many generations can you do that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is something that people in the US have also felt, is that this generation now is not going to live as well as their parents.
No.
And that is true in Singapore, see. It's true in Singapore as well. So, you know, time is running out a little bit. So I'm going to leave first with the last question. And I think it's a nice question because it will give everyone a chance to sort of sum up this, this whole idea of the post-COVID world. You know, where we rethink our ideas about what we need to consume, about how much energy we need to use, about how our relationship is with society, with the economy. So the question came from Dana, and her question was, what kind of development path could we take post-COVID for a more sustainable model? So we'll start from the back, okay? So the last speaker was Tan Hao. So I'll let you go first, and then we'll work our way through Tan Hao, Kirsten, Alfian, and then Connie will get the last word as the godmother.
Yeah, I think that we should go for not just blind growth, but equitable growth. We should reduce inequality. We should look after our poor people, disadvantaged people. We should look after the environment. We should encourage, discourage overconsumption. We should discourage over consumerism. And like, I really agree with Connie, be satisfied with less, I think.
Yeah, okay, always a difficult task. Kirsten?
I think we need to, as a society, not just as a government, but as a society, move towards thinking less about charity and meritocracy and more about solidarity. So when we are helping each other out, it's not in a, oh, I take pity on you and so I give you some money, because that's not very sustainable. We shouldn't be building a system where people who are poorer or less advantaged are depending on the goodwill of people who have more. It should be more about solidarity rather than just charity and voluntarism. You know, it's like, if I have time, then I will go and help you clean your rental flat. You know, it's not, we need to talk about things that are more sustainable and more about these underlying principles of, we are all in this
together?
country, we all have, well, we're not really all in this together because some are more in than others, and some are suffering more than others, but that we have a responsibility to each other, and that our well-being is interconnected. So, you know, like the well-being of the Grab drivers and the Deliveroo drivers are very interconnected to our lives, you know, because
Yeah, they are. But you know, as an infectious disease doctor, I can tell you the thing that really gets people is when they suddenly realize that, you know, it's going to affect somebody in New York or London. It's like, you know, people didn't really care about Ebola until you had the first 2 Americans who were infected. Then all of a sudden, Ebola became such a hot topic and all the drugs and vaccines started getting developed.
yeah.
So you're right. We all view our circumstances and have much more different levels of resources in dealing with them. But when you're dealing with a virus, it doesn't distinguish.
Yeah.
And I think that hopefully will be one of the messages that will come home from this pandemic. Alfian.
For me, actually, I mean, I'm not an economist, so I don't think I can sort of advise on a particular economic development path. But I would say, looking at the wider picture, I think Yasuism as a kind of national ethos, I think it's time to abandon that, and all this rhetoric about Singapore exceptionalism and this kind of like survivalist paranoia, right? That we always have to be a few steps ahead. We always have to be, so maintain a competitive edge. If not, we will lose it all. I think this is something that really needs to be
I
reformed.
totally agree.
Yeah, because otherwise it's really, we're living in a very socially Darwinian dog eat dog kind of world, right? You either sink or swim. So definitely more altruism, more empathy, and a different kind of social compact, as Kirsten has pointed out.
Very good. So
Yeah.
Connie.
Yes, of course. My point will be to everybody work together, and civil society be taken seriously and respected by government. And but also another point, I think we really do have to work towards a minimum wage, and that would make a difference to the way we see each other, you know. And my third point and final point was not brought up at all. We should work within the region and not depend on the states and China and so on. We have to be friends with our region. And Singapore, in fact, had always, if you look at our 700 years of history, had prospered because it worked within the region, with the region.
Yeah,
and
no,
so we have to develop friendships
I
with our
totally
neighbors.
And, you know, that's been one of the concerns that, you know, with all these travel bans and the idea that, you know, people coming in from overseas are dangerous, they bring in all kinds of pathogens with them. You know, many of us in the infectious disease community have argued that it's really important for us to help build capacity in the region for diagnosis and for treatments, because the Singapore is basically you know, an airport and a port. There's so much of our economy and our livelihood depends on people and goods moving through our country, and it's been like that. I did a show on radio a couple of days ago, and somebody said, you know, why don't we put all the migrant workers on an island before they come to work? And I said, you know, the history is actually interesting. And I discovered this a couple of years ago, that St. John's Island was actually the second largest quarantine island after Ellis Island.
I was there.
Oh, you
I
were
was there when we came back from India. We were quarantined in St. John's Island.
That's right, because they were afraid of TB and smallpox in those days, you know, before the war. And but the reality is, we acknowledge this issue, and so there's a lot of other questions, including this question about how many foreign workers should we have living in dormitories, and my answer to that is 0, because ideally, you know, the reality is, if we have a minimum wage, then the foreign workers who come in will be people who have particular talents and skills and abilities that we don't have, and we'll pay them a decent salary, and they can rent an HDB flat or a condo just like everyone else. And there's no reason to put them in a dormitory. So so that point, that's to answer that question. And like I said, there are a lot of these questions. Once again, thank you so much to all of the participants. It's been a really great discussion.
Thank you very much.
I think, this has highlighted the point that Connie made right at the very beginning, is that all of us are in civil society because we love Singapore. And this is something that people just cannot get through their head. You see, if you didn't love Singapore, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be speaking up. You'd just be sitting back, enjoying a comfortable life, taking care of your friends and your family and just keeping your mouth shut. But the fact that you can't keep your mouth shut is an indication that you feel that this place could be a better place to live in. And I'm going to end with Alfian's immortal words, and I want to get it right so that
what is that?
It's down at the bottom of the signature of your
but that's not a hopeful one though, Paul. I think. That sounds a bit pessimistic though.
No, it says that if you care too much about Singapore, first it'll break your spirit and then it'll break your heart. But this is what the pandemic has done. It has broken.
Okay, then but it will make you stronger, hopefully.
With a broken heart, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Every country and Western song is about that, right? You break your heart,
right.
You build a brave new world.
It does inspire some form of creativity. Yeah, there's some kind of like creative destruction there. You break your heart, but then you become this muse.
So I think that's what this virus has done to us. It's kind of broken everything up, and the opportunity is for us to put the pieces together and to have a say in what we want before the neoliberals come and take over, and we're back to square one. So on that note, thank you all very much,
so
and
much.
thank you all readers.
Thank you. Have a nice rest of the day.
A smiley face just now, so I sent one back.
You cannot be obvious about it. You have to be sneaky.
Well done.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are we still online?
Tan Hao, you froze quite a lot.
I thought it went really well. The technical part of it went pretty well.
Oh, I froze quite a few times.
Yeah,
you froze a few times.
I think when I go into
Just
the
your
chat,
image.
I go into the chat and read the stuff, then I